Welcome to Military Analytics. The course of the war seems to change with Ukraine's imminent counterattack. Although the Ukrainian army has not yet started its expected comprehensive offensive, the losses of the Russian army have increased. The Russian army, whose military personnel and ammunition problems are increasing day by day, is also losing the gains it made in the first months of the occupation. As Ukraine prepares to attack, Russia is uneasy. The region where this uneasiness is most clearly seen these days is Zaporizhzhia. In recent months, the Ukrainian armed forces announced that they were preparing for a comprehensive counterattack. This offensive aims to completely drive the Russian invaders out of Ukrainian territory and to take the territory of Crimea, which was unjustly annexed in 2014 from the Russian occupiers. The most important development on the agenda these days is that the Ukrainian army will attack the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia. In September last year, the Russian occupiers announced that they had captured the Zaporizhzhia region. However, Russia's declaration was not recognized by the world and not all of the region is under Russian control. Fighting continues in Zaporizhzhia. The nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia seems to be the end of the Russian occupiers. Russian occupiers announced that they will evacuate the civilian population in the region against a possible Ukrainian attack. The occupying governor of Zaporizhzhia Oblast, Yevgeny Belitsky, announced that he had ordered the evacuation of civilians from 18 different settlements in Zaporizhzhia. But there were facts that were hidden during this evacuation. Russian administrators also began to quietly leave this region. Soldiers in the army participated in the evacuation of civilians after disguise. Let's analyze the developments in Zaporizhzhia together. The National Nuclear Power Generation Organization of Ukraine has revealed a fact hidden by the Russian occupiers. According to Energoatom's Telegram account, it was revealed that Russian officials, including Yuri Chernyshov, the Moscow-appointed director of the nuclear power plant, left the region. Yuri Chernyshov fled the town and horror where the plant is located to Crimea. The National Nuclear Power Generation Organization of Ukraine said in a statement, "The current so-called managers of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant show a desire to rest en masse closer to the Kerch Strait, asking the Russians to go on vacation. The traitors are looking for ways to evacuate because they understand that the Ukrainian armed forces are already close. So there is very little time left to escape." Another statement about the developments in Zaporizhzhia was made last week by the British defense authorities. According to this statement, Russia was getting more and more worried about Ukraine's counterattack and was trying to take measures. One of the measures taken by Russia was to build fighting positions on the nuclear reactor buildings in the region. Because the conflicts around the nuclear power plant are increasing day by day. Rafael Mariano Grossi, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency of the United Nations, said that the ongoing fighting near the plant in Zaporizhzhia is becoming increasingly unpredictable and potentially dangerous. In a statement the other day, Grossi said, "I'm extremely concerned about the very real nuclear safety and security risks facing the plant. We must act now to prevent the threat of a severe nuclear accident and its associated consequences for the population and the environment. This major nuclear facility must be protected." The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant captured by Russian invaders is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. Ukrainian army's attack on this plant completely changes the course of the war. So much so that in the first months of the war, the Ukrainian leader Zelensky stated what would happen if this plant was attacked as follows: "If there is an explosion at the plant, it will end all of us. The end of Europe." According to a report by the Royal United Services Institute, an attack on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant could potentially lead to a repeat of the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear disaster. It could also result in a scenario similar to what happened in the Fukushima nuclear accident following an earthquake and tsunami in the Tohoku region of Japan in 2011. As the bombardment near the nuclear power plant continues, hidden facts are emerging. The Russian military announced that it had begun evacuating civilians from the Zaporizhzhia region. Civilians from 18 settlements are gradually leaving the region, but a striking claim was made about this evacuation. According to the allegations, Russian soldiers in the region are trying to escape from the region disguised as civilians, as it is known. Almost all Russian soldiers do not want to serve in the occupation of Ukraine. Therefore, since the beginning of the war, the Russian army has been facing a shortage of military personnel. Russian leader Vladimir Putin has been trying to solve this problem with military personnel, but without success. On the contrary, it creates more problems. Soldiers of the Russian army who do not want to fight are fleeing from the war zones. At the first opportunity, they find soldiers who leave Russian troops usually surrender to Ukrainian troops. So much so that since the beginning of the war, tens of thousands of Russian soldiers have surrendered to Ukrainian troops. This number is increasing every day. After the developments in the Zaporizhzhia region, Russian soldiers started to leave the region. Moreover, in a disguised way, there is no possibility for the soldiers to leave the region. For this reason, they took off their uniforms and started to escape from the region by blending in with the evacuated citizens in civilian clothes. Ivan Fedorov, the exiled mayor, Melitopol Zaporizhzhia Oblast, said of the fleeing soldiers, "There are some military personnel who are temporarily trying to flee the occupied territories. Therefore, our residents report frequent cases of Russian military personnel disguised in civilian clothes. One of the purposes of this is to try and escape from the temporarily occupied territory." A detailed analysis of the developments in the Russian-Ukrainian war clearly shows that the Russian occupiers have been steadily retreating since the beginning of the war. The Ukrainian army is cornering the Russian army with its soldiers who believe in victory. While the anger of the Russian people towards Putin is increasing day by day, the belief of the Ukrainian people in their leader and his army is growing. Contrary to Putin's expectations, Ukrainian leader Zelensky has taken a decisive stance against the invasion. Putin thought that Zelensky would soon give up and Ukraine would be defeated. However, with his success in diplomatic negotiations, Zelensky received the support of Western and European countries. The Ukrainian army has become a great power within the military contributions of Western and European countries. The Russian army suffered serious losses in the face of Ukrainian attacks from the first day of the invasion of Ukraine. The Russian people called for an end to the war, but Putin ignored these calls. Putin is jeopardizing his country for his own political career and interests. The course of the war shows that the Russian army will soon be defeated. War analysts say that the Russian army does not have the ammunition for a major offensive, and the shortage of military personnel is increasing every day. Putin is exhausted. Momentum is building for Ukraine's counterattack. The war in Eastern Europe continues at full speed in the south and east directions. Clashes are intensifying in Bakhmut, the last stronghold of the eastern front line. In addition, Ukraine's intensifications of its attacks near the Crimean Peninsula and the Kremlin makes Vladimir Putin very uneasy. According to Ukrainian officials, the reason for the intensifying clashes in Bakhmut is Russia's effort to seize the city on May the 9th, when the Victory Day is celebrated. While the Russian forces tried to occupy Bakhmut completely, Prigozhin's rebellion against the Kremlin, the explosions in Moscow, the Ukrainian offensive in Bakhmut, and the explosions in the Crimea stunned the Russian army. Moscow fears the precision-guided weapons could hit or run out of fuel. Elements of the Russian fleet anchored at the Sebastopol docks. Naval commanders of the Black Sea Fleet have shifted their warships from their traditional home base in the Crimea, Sebastopol, to safer waters in Russia. A top Ukrainian military intelligence officer said. Deputy Chief Major General Vadim Skibitsky announced that Russia's Naval High Command has redeployed BSF ships assigned to Sevastopol to the port of Novorossiysk on the eastern Black Sea coast, located on the east coast of the Black Sea in the Kuban region in the south of Russia. Novorossiysk is more than 350 kilometers from Ukraine. Novorossiysk is far away from the anti-ship missile launch sites and well out of range. According to Ukrainian Southern Joint Forces situation estimate, 2 Russian missile-carrying submarines left the Sevastopol base. Russian submarines joined a fleet of 11 ships in the eastern Black Sea. The Ukrainian intelligence officials' comments came after a pair of long-range attacks on fuel storage and production facilities in Crimea, which are critical to the fuel logistics supply chain. A mass drone attack on Ukraine's Tamanport fuel base hit a diesel fuel storage farm adjacent to the only bridge connecting mainland Russia to the Crimean Peninsula. The Kremlin administration claimed that the Russian air defense shot down 10 to 12 kamikaze aircraft. However, 2 of the kamikaze planes reportedly crashed into fuel reservoirs and exploded, causing a massive fire covering an estimated area of 1.3 kilometers squared. Russian officials said that 188 firefighters got the fire under control. The attack appeared to have set half of the base's fuel tanks on fire and potentially destroyed hundreds of tons of diesel fuel for use in Crimea, according to open-source satellite photos released by the US group Maxar. In another night attack, the Ukrainian plane struck and set fire to the buildings and fuel transport infrastructure at the Ilskoye refinery, about 150 ft from the Taman plant in Russia's Krasnodar Oblast. State-controlled Russian news reports and social media platforms showed that smoke continued to rise from the plant. Ukrainian journalist Andrei Teslenko stated in a Friday Telegram post that the primary role of the facility is to provide fuel to Russian military units in Crimea, especially the BSF. While the Kremlin struggled with the explosions in the Crimea and Moscow, it took heavy blows on the Bakhmut front as the conflicts intensify in Bakhmut. Russia is trying to seize the city of Bakhmut by May the 9th. This effort by Russia is embodied by the sending of more Russian paratroopers to the front lines. Ukrainian forces are fighting Russian infantry Wagner paramilitary group and Russian paratroopers in Bakhmut. The seriousness of the situation on the Bakhmut front, where heavy weapons from the air and ground are used, is also evident from the intense activity of the Ukrainian army around Kiev. Artillery and missile units blew up the bridge on the Chasy via Bakhmut highway. This bridge connected the only road to Bakhmut. Russian forces used this road to evacuate their wounded and to carry ammunition and additional forces. The only exit door of the Moscow troops was closed, but Russian soldiers are trying to hold on to the front lines. Russian forces are focusing their main efforts on conducting offensive operations in the Bakhmut, Avdiivka and Marinka directions. The Ukrainian Air Force conducted 6 airstrikes targeting Russian personnel and military equipment clusters. As a result of the air raids, the Russian positions were destroyed. Ukrainian missile and artillery units also struck 5 areas where weapons and military equipment were concentrated. 3 ammunition and fuel depots and an air defense system between Bakhmut and the tank crews stationed along the front. Attention is focused on the imminent battle that has become the epicenter of the battle. The conflicts in the region were divided into 2 areas. The first area is street clashes within the city. The second area is more distant fighting in fields and villages in the northwest and southwest, where Russian forces are trying to encircle Ukrainian soldiers. Petro, a tank operator in the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade, says the fighting in the northwest has slowed down with the arrival of new Russian reinforcements. Most of the tank crews note that the Russian defense was more than in the early stages of the war. Petro states that the war is increasingly becoming trench warfare. Still, tank operators say they are ready to break through Russian lines and look forward to the upcoming counterattack. While Kiev tank operators and troops wait for the moment to start the counterattack, Russia is increasing its measures, struggling with the shortage of military personnel and ammunition. The Russian army took a heavy blow with the latest offensive operations. Ukrainian armed forces defeat Russian troops on the front line. However, the problems experienced by the Russian army are not limited to rival attacks. The Russian army is also experiencing fractures within itself. Bad news continues to come from the Wagner troops fighting alongside the Russian army on the Eastern Front. Prigozhin, who is also known as the chef of the Kremlin, published a video about the ammunition problem they experienced in the war in Ukraine on the social media account of his company called Concord. Prigozhin showed the bodies of recently deceased Wagner warriors in a video released at night. The Wagner leader stated that these warriors were the children of some and their fathers. The Wagner boss noted that his fighters were killed for lack of ammunition. He stated that those who do not provide ammunition will burn in hell. Prigozhin took things forward, announcing his plans to withdraw from the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut. However, Ukraine said the fighters had reinforced their positions to seize the city before Russia celebrated the World War II Victory Day next week. In the video accompanying a written announcement of withdrawal addressed to military leaders, including President Vladimir Putin, Prigozhin reported that his troops would not suffer unnecessary and unjustified casualties in Bakhmut without ammunition. If you don't want to give the Russian people the victory of taking Bakhmut because of your little jealousy, that's your problem, he added in the video. The state-owned RIA News agency later reported that Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu had instructed one of his deputy ministers to provide the troops with all the weapons they need. It remains unclear whether Prigozhin, who often makes impulsive comments, will continue to withdraw if his men do get more ammunition. In addition, Ukraine accused Russia of attacking the besieged city of Bakhmut with phosphorus ammunition. Ukraine's defense ministry reported that Russia targeted the empty areas of Bakhmut with incendiary ammunition in drone footage released by the Ukrainian military. Bakhmut is seen in flames as rains that look like white phosphorus fall on the city. Other videos posted on social media showed raging fires on the ground and white clouds lighting up the night sky. Analysis of the video released by the Defense Ministry confirms that the footage is just west of Bakhmut city center and near a children's hospital. White phosphorus weapons are not prohibited, but their use in civilian areas is considered a war crime. White phosphorus is a wax-like substance that burns at 800 Celsius and ignites when it comes into contact with oxygen, forming bright clouds of smoke. They create rapidly spreading fires that are very difficult to extinguish. Russia has been accused of using white phosphorus in Ukraine at the beginning of the war, including during the siege of Mariupol. Moscow has never openly admitted to using the substance. Meanwhile, along the northern flank of the Ukrainian-controlled area on the outskirts of Bakhmut city, tank crews from the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade are waiting for the ground to dry before they can start a counterattack. Tank operators continue to support Ukrainian infantrymen and provide covert fire from afar during battles. But muddy roads and heavy spring rains brought on by molten ground have left them to play a lesser role. It seems that Ukraine wants to eliminate key areas for Russian forces before launching a counterattack. The destruction of important roads and supply lines, one by the Kiev troops, will weaken the Russian army. The weakened Russian troops are expected to deal the finishing blow in the summer offensives of Kiev. A shocking move from Ukraine. The Russian army was helpless against Ukraine. Russian soldiers raised the white flag. This advantage gained by Ukrainian soldiers has completely cornered Russia. The Ukrainian army has now reached a very different point. This raid on the headquarters in Zaporizhzhia has seriously consolidated Ukraine's regional dominance in the last days of the Russian-Ukrainian war. The Ukrainian army has gained one advantage after another. The Russian army has been stunned by its recent defeats. If the situation continues like this, it will not be long before the Ukrainian army will be able to end the war. With the desperation of the Russian army, Putin is at a loss. What to do? Many of the problems in Zaporizhzhia have resurfaced. The situation of Russian soldiers has been echoed around the world. Ukraine has recently started to take different steps using its intelligence network. Since the Russian army was not fully aware of this intelligence, it took action against Ukraine. But since the Russian army is reluctant to do so, it has become impossible to achieve the slightest victory against Ukrainian soldiers because of the internal confusion within the Russian army. Things to get completely different term, but at the same time, the critical information gathered by Ukrainian intelligence would provide the Russian army with the strongest blow it had ever been dealt. Ukrainian intelligence first sent directors to locate one of Russia's critical military bases in this region. The director scanned this area using sonar. Following these scans against the Russian army, the Ukrainian army mapped the entire region. A large number of unmanned aerial vehicles and Ukrainian special forces were mobilized in order to carry out an operation against the military base in this region, which is very important for the control of Zaporizhzhia. At the same time, Ukrainian troops began preparations for a very big step, knowing how critical this attack order was. They captured a number of tanks. But these steps have now completely cornered the Russian army. Ukrainian troops started to move towards Zaporizhzhia. The Russian army is cornered because Ukraine dominates every inch of the geography, while a large number of Ukrainian soldiers coming to this region approach the Russian military headquarters. Russian observation units started to make different moves when they detected the Ukrainian army. This time, the Russian army was prepared for such a raid on the headquarters. Since the Ukrainian army was aware of this preparation, it made that move to corner the Russian army, and this no doubt such a blow to the Russian army. Ukrainian soldiers first sent by over the Russian military headquarters. The Bayraktars, which were removed from the airport, started bombing the headquarters one after the other. The Ukrainian army also launched a ground offensive, but the Ukrainian army, which was divided in on the way, deployed some of its troops behind the corridors. The Russian army was not yet aware of this move. Ukrainian soldiers started to warn the Russian military headquarters. The Russians then showed that they would not surrender by opening fire. The Ukrainian army then moved the HIMARS closer to this area to bring it into range with the tanks already near the headquarters. The Ukrainian soldiers' pace quickened when the tanks started firing one after another. The outer walls of the Russian headquarters were heavily damaged. The Ukrainian Abrams were particularly effective at this point, thanks to the uranium-fortified barrels of these Abrams. The Ukrainian army fired shots that leveled the headquarters. Then it started to send infantry units against the Russian army. With the Ukrainian army sending these infantry units, Russian soldiers were helpless. They started to hide inside the headquarters because they could not withstand the power of the tanks, even though they exchanged shots. Then Ukraine's last critical move changed everything. Ukraine called for surrender after completely blockading the headquarters. At the same time, a large number of troops moved to surrender to the Ukrainian army. But when the last part of the Russian troops continued to open fire, the Ukrainian army pulled the Bayraktars back to this area and started shelling. At the same time, the Russian army decided to surrender by hoisting the white flag made from the sheets they had at their headquarters. After this, the confessions of the captured Russian soldiers literally drove Putin crazy. Many captured Russians stated that they were faced with great difficulties in Zaporizhzhia. After that, shocking allegations about the Russian army began to be put forward. The captive Russian soldier emphasized that Putin has not been able to deploy troops to this region lately. And the most important reason for this is the logistics problem. The logistics network was completely cut off as the Ukrainian army attacked this region one after another. However, the steps that Ukrainian soldiers would take here were constantly built to the Russian army. Putin constantly blamed the Russian army for its failed strategies and wrong policies. Because of this, the Russian army took its troubles to a different level and did not know what to do. Things changed completely when the Russian soldiers decided to revolt against their last commander. Putin has had two different targets to fight for some time now. Since the Ukrainian army was aware of these two different targets, they took care of their steps differently. While Putin's first enemy was the Ukrainian army, another enemy was recorded as the groups opposing Putin within the Russian army. By constantly clashing with these opposition groups, Putin paved the way for the Russian army to reach a troubled point. The Ukrainian army then realized that it had put Russia in a very serious crisis. If the situation continues in this way, there will be massive popular mobilizations and a very serious coup attempt in Russia. With the continuity of the situation, Putin's fall from power is expected to take place in a short time. But a critical comment made by war analysts has changed everything. According to war analysts, Putin's time in power is coming to an end. However, Putin no longer has the slightest chance of escape if he continues as he is. Putin will be put on a very serious trial when his rule ends in the near future. Both his crimes and his numerous war crimes will change everything. But many bureaucrats who were afraid of Putin's trial have also started to show themselves. All those who were held responsible for the Russian army's troubles in this region were cleared only because they were close to Putin. Although everyone realized that this closeness to Putin would cause problems after a while, Russia's policies, which have become more and more troubling, are the basis of a huge tension, and with the violation of many international laws, the Russian army is now at a point where it is at a loss as to what to do. If this continues, the Ukrainian army will win the war. And after winning this war, Ukraine's regional power will increase while Russia will have no influence at all. The Russians are thought to be aware of this. If Putin loses the war, all of Russia's moves in this region will come to an end. Russia will no longer have the slightest advantage, and many of the satellite countries around it will start to speak out against Putin. And if Putin's troubles get worse, Russia will not have the power to make the slightest breakthrough. This means that many balances will change in Eastern Europe, and the Russian army will be weakened by these changes.